Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. It's very, very nice to be here. In the last session, I decided to test my Spanish and listen without interpretation. And I did quite well for a while, but I was reminded of an occasion when I went to Japan and I was accompanied by another speaker whose presentation was entirely dependent on very complicated English wordplay. And it worked brilliantly if you understood English very well. And I couldn't understand how this could possibly work whilst he was being translated into an earpiece. And he assured me, don't worry, it's going to be fine. So I did my presentation, then he went on and he did his. And he did exactly the same jokes that he always does to an English audience. And I thought, I cannot understand how this Japanese audience is receiving this into their earpiece and finding it funny. But they did. They laughed at every single joke. It was hilarious. And at the end, I said to him, how did you do that? And he said, well, what the interpreter does is they just say to the audience, he has made a joke, please laugh. So I'd just like to say to the interpreters that if at any point I get boring, if you could just say, he has made a joke, please laugh. That might make it a bit of an easier audience. I want to talk to you about the rules of political communication. I want to describe what makes a great piece of political oratory, what makes something survive. That's the subject of my next book, When They Go Low, We Go High. And that, quote, is my answer to the question of who do I rate as a great speaker. I am going to say Obama, Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama's When They Go Low, We Go High at the convention was a wonderful speech because it gets into one phrase something very important about politics, which is that there's lots of low skullduggery, but there's something elevated and important about it as well. And we need to remind ourselves of that. And fine political communication is about the subject of politics at its best. And that's what Michelle Obama managed to capture in that wonderful speech. When I was a speechwriter in the British government, there were many members of the British cabinet who were not as good at speaking as the Prime Minister, Tony Blair. There was one in particular, our Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, who had a terrible tendency to talk for too long. And I said to him, what you should do, John, is before you speak, tell everybody in the audience how many points you're going to make. That way we understand where we are, and it helps us as an audience. He said, thank you very much, very good advice. And the next morning he stood before a large audience and he said, good morning everybody, I have 49 points to make. I have 5 points to make. And I start in 431 BC in Athens. And Pericles stands up to do a commemoration to the deceased of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. And he does what we now know as the funeral oration, where he does something very unusual. He doesn't just talk about the dead themselves. He talks about the city of Athens, and he talks about the idea of democracy for which he said they died. And it's in this moment that two traditions are born. Firstly, the tradition of rhetoric, and secondly, the tradition of democracy. And the reason they matter together is that it's only in a democracy that a politician has to persuade. A populist politician isn't really persuading. The populist is pretending that he or she already knows the mind of the people and is communicating it. A tyrant doesn't need to persuade because the tyrant is instructing or commanding, telling you the truth. The Democrat has to persuade. The Democrat needs to win the audience. And that's what Pericles does for the first recorded time. So these two moments of democracy and rhetoric are completely and utterly bound together. And in the great book about rhetoric, which is Cicero, De Oratore, Cicero sees no distinction at all between statecraft, politics on the one hand, and rhetoric on the other. To link to the conversation about the curriculum and how we teach it, rhetoric in the ancient world was a much bigger subject than just communication. It was what we regard as politics, the art of persuasion. And I think we should think of it like that, in a very broad way. Because this act of somebody standing here talking to you is the only thing which remains from the world of Pericles. When Pericles stood in 431 BC, the actual occasion was more like this than it was unlike this. Nothing else remains the same, but the act of rhetoric is essentially the same. And it's an extraordinary survival. I want to give you the 5 things I think go into a very fine speech. And the first is your appreciation of the audience. I often speak to audiences who are not experts in communication and rhetoric, and there I'm trying to give them confidence. Clearly, I come to speak to an audience of people expert in the field. My whole tone has to be different, because you know a great deal. So, of course, what I say is conditioned by the audience. I often get politicians coming to me now and saying to me, "Do you think you could make me a bit like Barack Obama?" And I have to say to them, let me count the ways in which you are not like Barack Obama. Firstly, you're not Barack Obama. But second, you're not President of the United States. And third, you're not a black man who is president of a country in an era when we still remember segregated cities. Now that is an extraordinary story to have before you stand up before your audience. Obama carried all that with him, and everything he said had that weight of history behind him. If you're standing to speak at a conference on local government somewhere in the middle of England, you don't have any of that. So your audience is expecting something different, and you have to respect the occasion and respect the audience. The technical term for this is decorous. That's Cicero's word. Decorum is a rhetorical term, and it means appropriateness. Be appropriate to the occasion. Respect the audience. Some of the great speakers have got this wrong. Let me give you an example. Winston Churchill may be the finest speaker in British history. His speeches in 1940 with the Luftwaffe in the sky are an extraordinary compendium of wonderful rhetoric, and they help turn the war. But Churchill had been trying those speeches all his life. You may remember that the finest hour speech, where he says, "Never before in the history of human conflict have so much been owed by so many to so few," which is about the Battle of Britain. It's beautiful. Let's go back to 1899. Winston Churchill is a candidate in the election for the Liberal Party in Oldham in the north of England. And he stands in Church Hall and he says, "Never before in the history of Oldham have so many people had so much to eat." And there's a sort of polite applause, sounds rather peculiar. 9 years later, he goes to Africa. He's now a junior minister in the government. And he stands around a hole in the ground at the opening of an irrigation scheme. And he says, "Never before in the history of Africa has so much water been held up by so little masonry." And it's really terrible. He's using exactly the same techniques, but the subject isn't big enough. And then, though, in 1940, when he says, "Never before in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few," it's not just better, but it's appropriate, because there is genuine peril, and the lavish rhetoric suddenly is appropriate to the audience, and it works beautifully. So you've got to think hard about that, about the audience. Your great speech needs a great moment. Bill Clinton was mentioned before, and in my forthcoming book, I don't include any Bill Clinton speeches, but I do include a Ronald Reagan speech. Now, that's not because I think Ronald Reagan was better than Bill Clinton. I don't. I do think Reagan was a good speaker, and in Peggy Noonan, he had one of the great speechwriters. But Clinton was a fine speaker. But Clinton lived and was president during a period of American history which relatively was prosperous and quiet. And that's a good thing. But it's harder to make memorable speeches about times which are prosperous and quiet. Perhaps if Yasser Arafat had not reneged on the deal in the Middle East, there would have been a great Clinton speech which would have had historic importance. If Clinton had been president of the United States at 9/11, he would, I have absolutely no doubt, have delivered a speech of remarkable brilliance. But he wasn't. So the speeches which are remembered are not necessarily those of the best speakers. They are of the speakers who were there at great moments, and that's a different category. The second point is character. Aristotle, in his book Rhetoric, places a great emphasis on the character of the speaker, which you have to communicate in the way that you talk. Let's go back to Nelson Mandela's wonderful speech before the trial in Rivonia, when he's on trial for being a terrorist. And he spends a lot of time, it's a 4-hour address, and he spends a lot of time establishing his character. And the character he's establishing is of an African, of a patriot. He's saying, I am not a communist. He spends a lot of time setting out that he's not a communist. He wants the ordinary virtues of every African. And he spends an hour making this case because he needs to demonstrate that he is a man of ordinary virtue to try and win over the trial judge. It's only then that he gets into the politics, because he has to build himself a character first. The most extraordinary speech of character that I found was Elizabeth I in 1601. The Spanish are there in the North Sea, ready to invade. And Elizabeth I goes to Tilbury in the River Thames, where the navy is gathered, and she speaks to them. And here's an extraordinary display of character, because Elizabeth I is very aware that the navy have one thing on their mind, which is not the Spanish. It's that she's a woman. And they do not regard a woman as the commander of the armed services. So she goes before them, and she does something wonderful, which is she notes their concern, and she says, I may have the weak and feeble body of a woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. And she describes exactly the fear they have, and then tells them that it's nonsense. What she's doing is creating a character for herself. And the historical idea of Elizabeth I that we still have today is essentially created in that moment. So Spencer in The Faerie Queene and most of the records afterwards take their cue from that speech. So it's a creation of character which then displays a formidable rhetorical power. The third point, and the most important of all, is what Cicero calls the topic, what Aristotle calls the seat of the argument. If you do not know what your message is in one sentence, then you're not ready to write and you're not ready to speak. You need to be able to write down on one short piece of paper what it is you are trying to argue. You have to be clear about it, and it needs to be a proposition, not just a subject. It's no good to say, I'm going to do a speech on Britain and the European Union. It's too broad. It needs to be a proposition. Why Britain should leave the European Union. Why leaving the European Union is going to be wonderful. Or why leaving the European Union is going to be terrible, which is, I should say, the true answer. You have to have a proposition as stark as that, because then that allows you to select your material. You could say anything in the course of your hour. We need to select. We need to be rigorous in just finding material which works for that proposition. The American playwright Arthur Miller once said that good writing is like an organism. Nothing is wasted. Everything contributes to the main argument. In order for that to be true, you have to be clear what the main argument is. And most speeches which fail because the speaker has not spent enough time clarifying their central point. So most people I train to write too early. And I encourage them to wait until they're clear what they're trying to say. How can you say it if you don't know what it is? You don't usually find it by writing. You usually find it by thinking. Speech writing is firstly thinking, thirdly editing, and there's a short process in the middle known as writing. But that should be the easy part. The thinking and the rewriting are where it really happens. And the primary part of that is to be clear what your case is, to define the problem. I'll give you the most famous example. Abraham Lincoln in 1863 went to Gettysburg, another war eulogy, the site of the war dead of the Civil War, the only site in the North. And he delivers 272 words, 2.5 minutes, which has become an incredibly famous statement of the American Republic. Government of the people, for the people, by the people. And it's a beautiful encapsulation. In 1961, John Kennedy told his speechwriter Ted Sorensen to read the catalogue of American rhetoric. And Sorensen came back and said, of all the speeches, the Gettysburg Address is the best one. And they tried to copy that. And that inaugural address is the shortest on record. And it's a wonderful speech. It's the one in which Kennedy ends by asking your country not what you can do for you, but what it can do for you, what you can do for it. Again, encapsulating in one vivid phrase the argument, because they knew what they were trying to say. And Lincoln does that beautifully. And he begins a tradition in American politics of going to Gettysburg to do a speech. And every American president has gone back to Gettysburg to do a Lincoln-type speech, with one exception. That exception was John F. Kennedy. In 1963, Kennedy was supposed to go to do the 100-year anniversary of Gettysburg. But unfortunately, 2 days before he was due to go, he was called down to Dallas on very important party business, from where he never returned. Eisenhower had to stand in for him. The moment I realized Donald Trump was an extraordinary political communicator was when, during the campaign, candidate Trump went to Gettysburg. And where every American president has gone to pay their respects to politics, to the American Republic, Trump did a 45-minute speech about how American politics were corrupt, the media were all fake, Hillary Clinton was a criminal. It was a disgraceful speech to do anywhere. But to do it in a cemetery at Gettysburg was a quite incredible affront to something noble. And it was at that moment that I realized that here is a man who did not respect the office to which he was seeking to be elected. And that was the moment I realized he was something quite extraordinary. Now, he has to be counted as a successful communicator, because in his own terms, he went from nowhere to being president of the United States. And that is success of a kind. He also has a style, and he has a character. He has some of the components of a fine speaker. For my taste, I don't like anything he says. And he's not conventional. He doesn't obey the rules. But there is a success of a kind. And I would also stress that Trump did have a central argument. His central argument, it's ridiculous, but he had one, which is that you, the people, have been robbed of your rights and your prosperity by them, the elite. Now, it's a childish idea, but it's a straightforward proposition. And it governs a great deal of what he says. And every time he's in trouble, he goes back to it. So he does demonstrate some of the rules of good communication, even though he's upsetting those rules at the same time. He's very interesting in that respect. My fourth point is the argument. And here's where Trump does not follow the rules. Here's where I think in the end he'll be found out, which is don't, if you can, don't exaggerate, don't caricature. Try to be respectful to opponents. That's not just because that's better for public conversation. It's also because it's better for your argument. I'll give you a Spanish example. The Spanish speaker I have in my new book is La Pasionaria, a Civil War activist, an extraordinary speaker who was incredibly famous at the time as the face of the Republican movement against Franco. And she was a remarkable speaker and who had a remarkable life. Her famous slogan was "No pasarán," they shall not pass. And she spoke in Madrid and she spoke in Valencia, two brilliant speeches with the same title. She had a central idea, but the reason she's important is that the first half of her career, where she was a vigorous opponent of Franco, when she made huge claims about how terrible fascism was, she was right. She was absolutely right. She was completely on the right side of that argument, and she articulated it beautifully, and her resistance seemed correct. It was correct. So she became a heroine of that struggle. However, in the second half of her career, when she left Spain and lived for 37 years in exile in the Soviet Union, where she remained an unrepentant apologist for Stalin all her life, even after the Soviet Union had denounced Stalin, she didn't. Her denunciations of capitalism were exaggerations, they were caricatures, they were foolish. So the second half of her career demonstrates what the first half of her career had shown to be false, which is if you speak plainly about your opponent, you've more chance of being believed than if you exaggerate what they do. We saw this a lot in Britain in the Brexit arguments, which I'll come back to in a moment, where the Remain side was seen to be exaggerating its case. It was seen to be saying that if we leave the European Union, then very quickly the British economy will collapse. There will be a huge shortfall in investment, growth will fall rapidly, jobs will decline, and when it didn't happen, it made the argument seem very exaggerated. Now, my own view is that will happen over a longer time period, but rhetorically, as a piece of communication, it did not work. It sounded too much. It didn't pay respect to the other side. The fifth point, and this does bring me back straight to the Brexit, is clarity. You need the most vivid description you can find of your case. Sometimes these days this is called the soundbite. But this is a good thing, not a bad thing. It is a simple fact that when you're writing for a politician, your speech will, at best, get 10 seconds on the evening news. So you might as well put some effort into trying to make sure that those 10 seconds are the best 10 seconds, that you get the 10 seconds that you would like to have. And in order to try and ensure that, your best tactic is to think of a very good phrase that summarizes your speech. All of the speeches I have in my book have that quality. I have a dream, their finest hour. They all can be described by their title. And that's good writing. And it's true of every good speech. Let me just reflect on the Brexit campaign in that context. Because the Leave side, which was not my side, had a very clear slogan. They encapsulated their point of view in the words, "Take back control." And that spoke to a sense that people had that their lives were not in their control. Now, it is an illusion that leaving the European Union will give you back that control. But it did speak to a genuine concern. And the argument was, if we leave the European Union, we will once again be in control of our borders. And people thought, yes, we're not in control of our borders, and I don't like this. Therefore, I want to take back control. It had an emotional charge, which the Leave side never was able to counter and was never able to repeat. So the Leave argument was very arithmetical. It was all about economics. It was all about the wider economy. But people don't really feel GDP. And they certainly don't feel next year's GDP. It all sounded very rational. It sounded, this is Aristotle, logos, the rational argument, versus ethos, the emotional charge. And Aristotle is very clear in rhetoric. He says that the emotion will always win over the argument. The feeling and the sensation. We have a tendency to think this is a novel thing in modern politics. It's not at all. Aristotle has long sections on this, and the Brexit campaign demonstrated that an emotional appeal was very powerful. When the Remain side tried to gain some emotional appeal, it failed. They tried it briefly by trying to invoke the Second World War to make the perfectly reasonable case that one of the reasons that there had not been conflict in Europe for 70 years was because nations had come together to trade together, to talk in common institutions. It's true, and it's possible to make an emotional case about that, but it failed because the distance in time was too great. Not enough people had enough of a memory of what that felt like for that to really work. There's also the very important fact that Britain's war was very different from the war experienced by every other European nation. Because Britain is an island, and because Britain wasn't invaded, it's always been the sense in the historical account of the war in Britain that this was, the European project was necessary for Europe, but not for Britain. Britain joined as a matter of economic advantage, but it wasn't necessary. And that sense of binding together and avoiding conflict was something that the Europeans needed to do, which Britain did not need to do. And so therefore, when David Cameron tried to make that case in the Brexit campaign, he was mocked, saying he thinks there's going to be a third world war. And the speech failed very badly as a piece of communication. It persuaded nobody. So throughout the whole campaign, the Remain side struggled to get any kind of emotional charge into their rhetoric, and they struggled because it was seen as an exaggeration on the economic side. So the campaign was won, in communications terms, very strongly by the Leave side. They had clarity, they had a really strong slogan, take back control, and they had an emotional resonance, which is, your life is bad, this will make it better. And in communication terms, that was very, very, very powerful. I was surprised that the Remain side managed to win 48%. I thought it would be bigger. Most people didn't. Most people expected Britain to remain within the European Union. I didn't know anybody, back where I'm from in the north of England, who was voting to remain. Not one of them was at all interested in the European Union. It had nothing to do with that. It was a series of other questions. And each one of them was an emotional question about the control of their own lives. And the Leave side very cleverly located that and used it as their main communication tool. And it worked very brilliantly for them. Let me end with a metaphor for Britain's future now, which is very hard to see. And it's also a metaphor for good writing and good communication. It's a lovely story about the sculptor Jacob Epstein, who did a bust of a Labour Foreign Secretary called Ernest Bevin. And on the day that the sculpture was unveiled, he was asked, how do you get such a good likeness of Ernest Bevin? He said, well, what I do is I take a big block of marble and I just take off every bit that doesn't look like Ernest Bevin. And that's what writing is like. It's in there somewhere. And Britain's future outside the European Union is in there somewhere. We don't know what it is. But just because we didn't like the outcome, and I didn't, doesn't mean that as a piece of communication, it wasn't hugely effective, because it was. Thank you very much.